Thank you. He just stole the first line of my talk. So I'll go to the next slide. We're going to see how do we test Perl, how well do we test Perl, and how can we, meaning you, help. So there are 5 stages of testing of the Perl 5 core distribution. Testing by individual contributors, committers, smoke testing, by CPAN testers, and by the outer world. We will consider each in turn. The way anyone can contribute to the Perl 5 core distribution is very well described in the documentation called Perl Hack. Because that documentation is so good, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the details of that. If you want, read Perl Hack, look at the bonus slides to this discussion, or contact me at any time in the conference, or there's some of the other Perl 5 contributors are at this conference as well. For our purpose, what is important today is that any changes to the Perl 5 source code must be accompanied by tests. And in doing this, you will follow the example of Larry Wall, who contributed this, the first test in the first commit to Perl 1 in 1987. What's even more important is that before you submit any code to the core distribution, that you run the entire test suite before submitting your patch. Once all your tests pass, you add and commit your changes, you prepare a patch per the instructions in Perl Hack, that document I mentioned, and you attach the patch to an email and you send it to perlbug@perl.org. The main point is you run the entire test suite before submitting a patch. Now, what happens once you do send a patch to Perlbug? Your patch will appear in our bug tracker, rt.perl.org. That's RT is maintained by Best Practical Solutions, one of the sponsors to the conference. And it will also be cross-posted to the Perl 5 Porters mailing list or news group, depending on which you prefer. The Perl 5 Porters are the people who have authorization, known as commit bits, to commit code to the Perl 5 Git repository. It is a committer's job to triage bug requests and also for requests for changes in the source code. Non-controversial changes, such as, say, spelling corrections, they can be immediately applied to the master branch. The master branch of our repository is known as Blead, spelled B-L-E-A-D, but pronounced Bleed. Anything that really needs discussion gets discussed in RT or on the mailing list before it's applied to Bleed. The committer may wish to see how well your patch performs on different platforms. In that case, the committer can prepare what is called a smoke me branch inside the Perl 5 Git repository. The committer will then apply your patch to that branch and push that branch out to the origin, to the repository. And what that does is it triggers certain tests run on various types of machines around the world. Let me make this a bit more concrete. Recently, we had a patch submitted by a fellow named Sullivan Beck, who is the maintainer of the locale codes distribution on CPAN, and locale codes is distributed as part of the Perl 5 core distribution as well. It was a large update, and so what I did when I saw the patch on RT was that I created a smoke me branch in our repository. I applied his patch to that branch, pushed it out, and triggered smoke tests on a wide variety of machines. So, what exactly is smoke testing? It's running the core distribution's test suite on as many different platforms and configurations as possible, platforms configured by individual members of the Perl community. In doing so, we generally use a CPAN module called test smoke. And the fact that this is up on CPAN means that all of you can do this as well. When you install test smoke on your machine, you get 3 directories: git-perl, perl-current, and install. Now, all the interesting stuff takes place in the install directory, the configurations, variables, the actual run programs, and so forth. I won't go into the details of that, but suffice it to say that to kick off, once you've got this installed, all you need to do is to run a shell script called smokecurrent.sh, and it will trigger a smoke test run. You can kick off one of these smoke tests manually. That's what I usually do. For example, on this machine here, I have 2 virtual machines which run different versions of the FreeBSD operating system. And I try to perform a smoke test run in each of those virtual machines on each of those FreeBSD versions every couple of days. But there are people with better hardware and, more importantly, better sysadmin skills than I have, and they often choose to automate their smoke tests. And you can do that by putting them in a cron job and running them, say, once a day. Or you can figure out a way to listen to the Perl 5 Git repository and kick off smoke test runs on a per commit basis. If you use test smoke in its typical configuration, the results of your smoke test run are sent to this website, perl5.test-smoke.org. Here is a screenshot of its home page. And farther down on the home page, we have the latest smoke test results on each of a wide variety of configurations that our smoke testers have contributed. Now, let's see. Right. And we can drill down further. We can, for example, get the latest test results from the FreeBSD operating system. And in addition, one of our main contributors, Tony Cook, maintains a site called develophelp.com. And this lists in a more compact form the latest results on a per commit basis. So here we see, for example, the latest, some late results on the Perl bleed or master branch. And we can even get smoke tests for particular branches. For example, I mentioned that I created a smoking branch for locale codes earlier. We can go to this web page and we can see how well did this particular branch do on various operating systems. So, okay. So, over the past 30 years, Perl has been ported to a wide variety of operating systems and configurations. We try to keep Perl 5 alive and kicking as long as possible on as many operating systems as possible. We try to keep it alive to end of life and sometimes beyond. We also try to ensure that Perl configures, builds, and tests correctly on all these operating systems. So for us, we want Perl to work everywhere, and to do that, we have to test Perl everywhere. But we can only accomplish this if we get timely results as to whether we are passing our tests on these operating systems, old and new. And this means, believe it or not, that we have to test Perl 5 on operating systems other than Linux. Now let me give you a concrete example of the value of diverse smoke testing, which we experienced over the past year. In early 2016, Carl Williamson did a tremendous amount of work on improving Perl's handling of locales. Once we shipped Perl 5.24 in May of 2016, Carl's work was merged into Bleed. And there were a few smoke test failures here and there, but they were all very quickly corrected. At that time, however, almost all our smoke test reports were coming from Linux. So we had no information as to what was happening on other operating systems. In particular, between May and August of last year, the number of smoke test reports that we had on FreeBSD was 0. So last August, I decided to address this lack of BSD smoke test reports by setting up a virtual machine running FreeBSD on this laptop that you see here. As of last August, the latest production release of FreeBSD was 10.3. I used VirtualBox to set up a FreeBSD 10.3 VM on this machine. It natively runs Ubuntu Linux. And after getting used to this environment, I decided to set up a test smoke configuration inside the VM. Now, after a lot of sweat, this was August in New York City, remember? I finally got my first FreeBSD 10.3 smoke test report sent off to testsmoke.org. Note that this was the first smoke test report from FreeBSD in at least 4 months, maybe ever, and the first report from FreeBSD in the 5.25 to 5.26 annual development cycle. Fortunately, the result was a pass. Okay. In October of last year, however, the FreeBSD team released 11.0 as the latest production release. I realized that I did not know whether Perl 5 Bleed would build and test correctly on this new version. So I set up a second VM, this time using VMware, and installed FreeBSD 11.0. I then set up a test smoke configuration and triggered my first smoke test run. This was the first smoke test run on that system, but it was a fail. To make a long story short, and not worse, it was a failure in the test called liblocale.t, which suggested that the problem was with the locale-related code that Carl had committed 5 months previously. Well, to make a long story short, it took us more than 2 months to correct the failures. But it would have been so much easier if we had been testing on FreeBSD 11 during its development process. So this is the importance of diverse smoke testing. So far, all we've talked about are running the tests in the Perl 5 test suite, what we'll call the primary test suite. But we can also use the code that's up on CPAN as a secondary test suite. For example, if you go to matrix.cpantesters.org for any given Perl distribution, you can see how well it runs or what have been the test results on different operating systems, different versions of Perl. And sometimes these operating systems lead to BBC tickets. Now, for many years, I thought that a BBC ticket meant a bug ticket filed by a Perl developer working at bbc.co.uk in London. That's not correct. No, what BBC means in this context is Blead Breaks CPAN, which means that a change in the leading edge of Perl broke something on CPAN. And those BBC reports, they're frequently filed by Andreas Koenig or Slaven Rezik, and then it becomes the job of the Perl 5 Porter committers to determine, is there a defect in the code recently committed to Bleed that caused a failure in valid CPAN code? Is there a defect in the CPAN module or a substandard code that is exposed by the change in Bleed, or is there some combination of above? Regardless, we take BBC tickets very seriously. If the problem is in the code in Perl 5 Bleed, that ticket becomes a blocker for the next release of Perl 5. We strive for backwards compatibility. Sometimes we have to break things due to security fixes to enable Perl's continued growth, but we can use CPAN as a proxy for all the Perl 5 code that's out there into production. Now, some of you may know that in the past year, we had a major security problem in Perl in which we had to change how we handled dot, the current working directory in Array Inc. This affects every instance of the use, require, and do built-in functions. We had to do a careful review of all the modules, scripts, and tests in the core distribution. But in addition to that, we tested all or almost all of CPAN to see how well it would perform once we made this change in Perl 5. This required a tremendous amount of work on behalf of the Perl 5 porters, the people known as the Perl toolchain gang, and the authors and maintainers of CPAN installers such as CPAN, CPAN Plus, CPAN Minus. So it was a lot of effort. Now, at this point, we have to ask, are our primary and secondary test suites enough? And I would argue no. The problem is that because of Perl's age and ubiquity, there is a tremendous amount of code written in Perl that's out there in production in the wild, and some of that is in like programs, utilities that are in widely available open source software distributions. For example, we have the autoconf problem. GNU autoconf depends on Perl, and other GNU utilities in turn depend on autoconf. We discovered multiple problems of that having to do with the dot problem and also with another warning that was fatalized. And we actually had to revert some code that we wanted to commit to Perl 5.26.0 because the autoconf people were not doing releases on a timely schedule. So what I'm going to be arguing is that we need a tertiary level test suite in which we identify programs found in major open source software distributions that are written in Perl, and that we periodically test them as part of Perl 5's ongoing development process, and that we have constant communication with the Perl maintainers of these distributions so that we can identify problems early and keep Perl moving forward and keep all these utilities that use Perl moving forward as well. So, how you can help: subscribe to the Perl 5 mailing list or news group, test Perl 5 Bleed on your everyday development machine. If you're in a company, see if you can clone your organization's testing environment and see if it will run with the monthly Perl 5 development point releases. Set up a smoke testing rig with test smoke, particularly on non-Linux platforms. Test your CPAN distributions against Perl 5 Bleed, and help us to identify open source applications written in Perl that we can test against Perl 5 Bleed. Thank you. Although I think I exhausted the time since we're going to the lunch break. Anybody have questions, they can either raise them or come up and talk to me, whichever. Questions from the audience? Okay, so I'm available to answer any questions based on the content of the talk, and there are, attending the conference, there are, well, for example, right here we have this little posse of pumpkins, past, present, and to come, so they can answer questions on how the Perl 5 porters work to, maintain and work with the core distribution on an everyday basis. Thank you.